Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. This is our river herring survey training. So if you're here, it's because you're interested at looking at streams and possibly or possibly not seeing some fish. But thanks all for coming. We're hoping to keep this within an hour. We do have Kevin here, who's from Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. He's going to kick us off talking sort of about this project on the whole, a little bit about his work at DEEP and why we're all here. And then he'll take some questions, hopefully give some answers. And then Aliki and I are going to talk a little bit on logistics. So what you'll be looking for out in the field, how to submit data, again, why we're doing this at Connecticut River Conservancy, and get into all that. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Kevin.
All right, thank you, Kelsey, and hi, everybody. So I'm Kevin Job. I'm a fisheries biologist with Connecticut DEEP. I'm in the diadromous fisheries program, and I'm the river herring, shad, and lamprey guy, I guess would be the best way to put it. A little bit more background with river herring, what we do. I'm the one who runs the trap at Bride Lake for all the trap and truck. So all the run reestablishment around the state. Last year we moved 32,000 fish out of there. This year we're going to shoot for 35,000 fish. So that project is going and looking and finding these extirpated runs, or runs where there's a very, very small remnant run that maybe every other year it's just at the point where we've given them 2 or 3 decades to really try and reestablish themselves. And for whatever reason, some of these places we have, there was a dam at the head of tide, and we just lost all but a few of those fish. The alewives are interesting because it seems as though they're young of these can actually deal with elevated salinity, and that's why we still have fish in those places. But for the most part, what we're dealing with our trucking operation are these remnant runs or completely extirpated. And from our standpoint, that's where CRC really comes in, because we just don't have the power and the people to get out and do all of these checks up and down the Connecticut River. And we know we have all these runs. For example, in the early 90s, the big 3 in Glastonbury, pewter pot, salmon, and roaring, they used to have huge runs of blueback herring. And we didn't have people out monitoring per se to see what the run size was, but what we had were all of our conservation officers and recreational fishermen were utilizing those runs for recreational bait. And what we have is the record from those guys going out every day and the run size just getting lower and lower until the point where we closed those runs. And you can go back in the 90s, it was 1996, we might have started closing maybe weekends first, and then, after a certain time at night, until we eventually had to completely close the fishery, do a full moratorium in 2001 for the whole state. So that's kind of where this program started. We do a lot of fishway construction, a lot of dam removal, but on top of that, where I come into play is going out and actually seeing what runs still exist, the runs that do exist, trying to monitor to figure out the size of those runs. I work a lot with Yale University, UConn, UMass, looking at the size of those juveniles from those the spawning stocks that still exist. And then again, when we're actually going out and trucking these fish, going in and looking at what is the health, what's the success, what's the growth rates of these fish. So we're not going out and just trucking fish, bounty apple eating fish everywhere. We have either fish counters or someone actually out there actively looking to see the size of the fish, growth rates, how's the zooplankton population responding to us putting these fish in there. And that's for the Connecticut River where you guys really come in. It's because we can't get up there but a few times a year unless we have a monitored fishway. We have 71 fishways across the state that we are in charge of doing something with, and the majority of those are actually private. It's just part of that agreement when they were installed was that we would, open and maintain these fishways. So we're out doing that, running electronic fish counters, video monitoring software. But the runs up the Connecticut River, we have the big rivers covered. We have the Farmington covered, the Mattabucket covered, Salmon River is covered. But some of these smaller places, the Moodus Rivers, the Salmon Brooks, we don't have the ability or the people to get out there because we're actively running around all day and sometimes even on the weekends, and we just can't be everywhere at once. So for us, the big thing that we get out of volunteers in this sense is really that presence absence data. We don't expect people to go out and build a weir on a stream and install an electronic fish counter and monitor it like we do everywhere. For us, the big thing is this presence apps data. So we can go back and look and say, you know, we have all this fisheries or all these fishermen data from the 90s, and it's all just through word of mouth coming through the COs, but that was, you know, taken down. So we have news articles, we have all these just put away in manila envelopes. We started pulling those out and then going back and trying to revisit those sites. And this was, I think it was 2001 or 2002 that they started doing visual surveys. The problem is shrunk in size of biologists, size of seasonal help, and we just can't make it to all those sites anymore. The other thing that keeps happening is fishways keep being built. So back then we had 17 or 18 fishways, now we have 71. So all of this emphasis is we're putting it more into actually operating all of our equipment. So to have people go out and record this data and come back to us, say we were going to start trucking on the Scantic River. Well, we haven't been able to get into the Scantic to sample in years. So all we have is observational data. So I can pull up this observational data and say, well, you know, if we look at this compared to all the other runs in the system, we're actually seeing quite a few fish here based on what our observers are seeing, the volunteers are seeing in the field. And even though we've seen genetically the fish are very similar across the Connecticut coast, we don't want to go and truck a bunch of fish from Bride Lake into a system where we know we have maybe 5 or 6 really good nights of fish running. We don't want to mix stocks if we don't have to. So having that data to be able to pull up and say, okay, well, what did the CRC volunteers do in 2021? Oh, wow, yeah, they had fish, you know, 5 out of the 15 nights they were there. Now we can start figuring out how we're going to get in there and actually sample and see what kind of success rate we have. And it just saves us so much work. It's great to have people that can get out there and let us know what's going on, because then that gives us the ability to then come in, say, the next year or the year after that. Whenever we have interest in that system, now we're not going in blind. We don't waste 2 or 3 years trying to gather that spring data. And I think, Kelsey, you had maybe more defined questions. So I think that's the background. Do you have anything else you want to ask?
And I think that's really helpful. I guess I'll just underline that this has been a really great partnership for us here at CRC to be working collaboratively with the state. For one, it gets volunteers out there excited in the river, but I do want to emphasize that you all collect really valuable data to help Kevin and the folks at DEEP continue to do their work, and not just at DEEP, but also at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So working amongst all these organizations can be complicated, but very, very useful. And I do want to, we only have Kevin for a short amount of time today before he has to run. So if there's anyone on this call who wants to ask the field expert any questions, this is your chance. You should be able to unmute yourself, I believe.
Hi, this is Dennis Latcham with the Lebanon, Connecticut Inland Wetlands. And I was wondering if the state is going to continue all the information that Mr. Gephardt was passing out about the alewives and the river herring and the shad and stuff. I found it to be very, very interesting. I've been following him for years, and even at a radio show down from New London, I believe, streaming show. Is that going to continue?
So it's going to be tough this year. With Steve's retirement, we also lost another biologist to another program. So he's kind of on retainer for when we're really back in the field. I'm going to actually try and get stuff to Steve for his radio show. But the problem is I only operate the electronic fish counters. The video monitoring it's counted by seasonals and run by another biologist. And that biologist has actually taken over for Steve all things, FERC relicensing, dam removals, fishway constructions. So he's basically doing 2 jobs at the same time right now. So for his video data to be reviewed in a timely manner, he'd actually have to miss out on field work. And we just don't want to risk missing fish passage season work for that. I'm going to try and get my electronic counts to Steve, hopefully on Fridays. I think his radio show is Tuesdays, but I'm not 100% sure. But I can find out and let Kelly know. It's going to be tough this year. We're down, I'd say probably 40% staff from what we historically ran. And we actually are still trying to get seasonal staff on now. So I'm pretty much, I leave the house and I'm in the field nonstop. And then like, I haven't even done emails yet today. So unfortunately, it's going to be a little rough this year until we have a supervisor who takes over the lead on that. Can't say 100% sure. I'm hoping to get, when I send those numbers out, I'm hoping to send them to people like Kelsey who have asked for them in the past. But the problem is I can't guarantee when, because if I'm trucking fish until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I've still got to go back and deal with all the other stuff that happens in the office. So there'll be something, but it won't be Steve's weekly report this year. What happens next year, I hope we have something. I just don't know in exactly what form it's going to be. Steve, that took the better part of a day and a half to compile all of that. And without Steve at the wheel of that, we can't afford to have fish left behind while we're out there. So it's an unfortunate answer, but it's kind of the reality of where we're at this year.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and say, I mean, as Kevin said, nothing as comprehensive as what Steve put together is going to be available this year, but we are trying to work with Kevin and with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to at least report out to our volunteers and to our membership about what we're finding in the Connecticut River watershed. I know Steve did a broader geographic range, but we are going to at least try and share our information, some of the state's information, just so people feel in the loop. And I see a question in the chat, what is the radio show? Steve does I think it's a bi-weekly radio show on ICRV radio. So if you Google that, you can find his program. And I believe it's called Deep Outdoors, DEEP. Is that right, Kevin?
I can't remember exactly. We've always called it his fish show. So
okay.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact name. I apologize.
That's okay. You'll find it under programs on that website. Very interesting. He's still doing it. There's another question for you, Kevin, in the chat. It says, how far north do you find herring?
Yeah, so I've personally seen them in the Scantic for, I mean, the problem is at that point you're dealing with how far the alewives go, how far the bluebacks go. The bluebacks, historically, if you look at the Holyoke Passage data, we would move 600,000 fish through the Holyoke Dam in Massachusetts. Now it's a few thousand with the collapse of the herring population from the late 80s through the 90s. We all but lost that run of bluebacks up into Massachusetts. But as far as the main rivers concerned, like Enfield Dam, they used to pile up like crazy below there, and we'd be able to see them. I'm sure they still push. I mean, we see them at Holyoke. They don't seem to pass through Holyoke. But the lower tribs or the upper tribs in the northern part of Connecticut, we still get a mix of alewives and bluebacks. The Farmington River, we get a few, but they're reluctant to use that fish passage based on the design. It's an old, outdated design. The larger fish don't have a problem. It's those smaller fish that don't seem to have that push. Also, a lot of these places, it's likely that because they've been blocked for so long, the fish population just isn't at the size where they're pushing each other to move further upstream. And we have trucked a little bit in the northern reaches, but we're so focused with our alewife stocking on the smaller coastal streams at the moment. We don't actually have a good place to catch blueback herring at the moment. We use Weathersfield Cove when they're in there in large numbers. We'll actually purse seine them out and load them into the truck and move them up into the Farmington River. We actually stock Dunning's Pond with them, trying to get a population or run started on the Farmington. But it just seems that the blueback population is so small, they just don't really push out. The nucleus of that population seems to be around the Glastonbury area, and they don't appear to be pushing out that far anymore. So we used to have sustained runs to the base of Leesville Dam on the Salmon River. Even in my lifetime, it was large. And we get a couple good days there now. Moodus River, we'll get a couple good days, but it's just not like it used to be. And that's kind of, unfortunately, where we're at with most of the Connecticut River runs. But yeah, they go all the way up through Massachusetts.
All right, any other questions before we let Kevin go? All right,
It looks like there's a question from Tyler Ray to everyone. It says, what helps restore herring runs? So in a lot of these situations, we have dam removals, we have fishway constructions. Dam removal is obviously the optimal situation, but we live in a very anthropogenically changed region of the world, and people don't want to lose their ponds, their lakes, their water features. So often we have to go with the fishway design. So in that case, now we have the fish, once we get a fishway dialed in, they work well. So once we get fish upstream, it's honestly, from what we found, appears to be a food driven charge to get the fish restored. If you have really good habitat, but not a lot of zooplankton, the fish don't seem to respond that well. If you have really bad habitat, but really good food sources, it seems like they do pretty well. The fish will often grow really quickly in a lot of these places. If you go up north, we'll have fish run up in the main rivers. The fish aren't leaving till sometimes as late as November, just because their size, they're not ready for going out to sea. But last year we had on the Mattabesset, we stocked Kensington Pond, which it's a fairly influenced pond from people. It's a big man-made lake. It turns green in the summertime. It's, when you look at it, you're like, okay, yeah, it's not the greatest habitat, but it's full of plankton and it's full of nutrients. And by June last year, the juveniles were already massive. They were the size of fish that we normally see leaving in late fall in June. So there's so much food in there that once the fish get up through the fishway and into the lake, when they spawn, the juveniles do really, really well. So it's kind of an interesting thing. You can put a fishway onto a very pressured system and the fish tend to do really well. And then other times you can get them into these, what you'd think is a beautiful, pristine lake, and the food source just isn't there and they don't produce the population you'd expect them to produce. So I hope that helps answer that a bit.
All right.
I see this question about the dam relicensing, about changing the Enfield Dam to allow them to pass. So right now, the Enfield Dam is essentially non-existent. If you go there, you can see some of the leftover crib working and some of it's still, there's a structure there, but that the fish pass through the Enfield Dam, no problem. It's basically just a little speed bump during low water, and during high water, it's a non-issue. Shad, river herring, lamprey, they all get right over it.
All right, I see someone's preparing to ask a question, so maybe we'll come back to that. All right, there it is.
All right, let's see.
Does the Holyoke fish elevator work for herring?
Yeah, so it worked when there were herring. That's the answer to that question. There's been some modifications. I know in 1975 they did some work on it, and more recently they've done some work. But yeah, it used to pass hundreds of thousands of river. I think the record it might have actually been over 1 million fish. It was high hundreds of thousands, and that was the norm in the 80s. It was, you look back at the numbers, 100, 200,000 fish. That was a common thing. Moving forward with that, I don't think that the changes would have affected that because we saw those same drops in our smaller fishways in Connecticut, and it seems to have just been a collapse of that blueback herring run. It was never an ewife run at the Holyoke Dam. It was always blueback herring. The alewives just didn't seem to move up that far, and I believe, I could be mistaken, but I believe U.S. Fish and Wildlife did get alewives from us for a few years to try to get them in the oxbow up by Amherst, but that wasn't in my time, so I'm not sure. But yes, that fishway did used to pass a lot of fish, but if you go down below there now, you're not seeing hundreds of thousands of fish piled up. It's just that the fish that are remaining don't seem to have that urge to pass. It's not that there's hundreds of thousands of fish sitting below the dam not passing. It's that we don't have those hundreds of thousands of fish anymore, unfortunately, at least not going up there. In the Glastonbury area and the main stem, it still seems like there is a decent amount of fish spawning in the cove. So,
all All right, thank you. And I see a very good question. What do volunteers do? Which is a great segue. I think we're going to move on to the next part of our training, which is a little more background and what you will be doing. So if we get any more questions for you, Kevin, I'll email those to you and we can send responses out to the group. But I really appreciate you coming in for the short amount of time you have to share your experience and expertise with us. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for everybody who came to listen and ask questions. We're in the middle of the busy season, so I apologize. I've actually got to hop off here and get caught up on all things email, so I haven't even had a chance to open those up today. So, but yeah, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. If anyone has any questions, feel free to send them my way. And thank you, guys. We'll see you later.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. All right, you should be able to see my screen now. We're doing this a little bit backwards, as you can see. We just wanted to make sure Kevin got a chance to participate. I'm grateful that he's here. So if you're here, you probably have found our website. We're the Connecticut River Conservancy, CRC. Just a very quick background on who we are. We were founded in 1952, so we're actually the second oldest watershed organization, meaning an organization that's focused exclusively around the river valley, not state specific, not region specific, but matching those natural borders we see around the Connecticut River and its tributaries. We're a membership-based organization, which means we rely on all different kinds of partners. So our partners at the state level, local level, and then of course, individual level. So volunteers and supporters of our work. And that work includes a lot of different things. So I've listed out a few of them here. We do things like legislative advocacy, or we review permits. We engage with folks like you to carry out community science projects and do monitoring, like water quality monitoring, fish species monitoring, and then we do invasives removal, which requires some monitoring as well. Public engagement through outreach, education, speaking events, and then we do some fun things. We go paddling in non-COVID times. We had a lot of events that were just a celebration of the river, getting out there and enjoying ourselves. And then restoration, that could include things like dam removals or removing barriers to fish passage, tree plantings. And then a big volunteer event we have every year in September is our Source to Sea cleanup, where a couple thousand volunteers get out to the Connecticut River all within the same time period and pick trash out of the river. So moving into the river herring training. And again, I know this is a little bit backwards, but we're gonna rewind to the basics. So if some of the terms you heard earlier were confusing or foreign, don't worry about it. You don't need any prior experience or knowledge to be here. We're just glad that you're here. So a river herring at its most basic level is a fish. And it includes actually two kinds of fish, alewife and blueback herring. And these are migratory species. So they're called anadromous herrings, meaning that they live part of their life in a marine ecosystem and part of their life in a freshwater ecosystem. So each spring at around this time, when it starts to get warmer, river herring are actually coming in from the Atlantic Ocean through the Long Island Sound and up the Connecticut River and into its tributaries. And then again in the fall, they will migrate back down. So, or the juveniles will. They come up here to spawn, meaning that they're going to reproduce in these habitats that Kevin was describing. And then he also touched on this a little bit as well. Both of these species, the alewife and the blueback herring, historically had been really abundant in our rivers, you know, teeming full of life kind of. And then with the introduction of dams, impacts on fisheries in the Atlantic Ocean, these populations have really crashed, and they're starting to sort of rebuild. Those populations are growing back, but that's part of the importance of this work, is really understanding the health of this population, seeing where are the river herring, and importantly, where aren't they? So sort of continuing in that vein, I talked a little bit about impediments to fish passage. So that includes things like dams or culverts, which are, if you're ever driving on the highway or something, you see one of those big round tubes that has water flowing through it. If those are up high, fish can't necessarily jump into them and then continue to migrate upriver. So we call those fish barriers. And organizations like Connecticut River Conservancy, the state, a lot of NGOs in the area are working to remove these barriers to fish passage through things like dam removals. However, Kevin also sort of alluded to this, a dam removal is, even though it's our first choice because it restores the flow of the river and migration upriver, it's not always feasible. So we live in a world where some people, where a dam might have historic value, might have aesthetic value, or it's just not quite feasible in the location to take it out. So when that's the case, we work with organizations to construct fishway passage, what could be an elevator or a lift or a ladder. Kind of going in a more extreme direction, there are fishery closures, and we'll touch on this later. It is actually illegal to take river herring just as their population is bouncing back. We want to make sure that they're given every opportunity to do so. And then sort of where we all come into this is in the research end. So in order to carry out all of these projects here, we need to show government agencies, the general public, and importantly funders, that there's information or a lack of information here that is guiding our decision to engage with this work. We talked about dams, and I just want to quickly touch on this to go over sort of the scope of the issue. So the Connecticut River watershed, which includes all the tributaries and streams that eventually go into the Connecticut River and then the Long Island Sound, is one of the most dammed watersheds in the entire country. And that's partly because it has a ton of really old historic dams that were put in place, are no longer used, but have remained there as an impediment to fish migration. So there are, I think, 12 on the main stem of the river, but hundreds on the tributaries. And as you can see here in this map, some of them do have fishways and some of them do not. And of course, where there is no fishway, there's no fish getting past that dam. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Aliki to talk a little bit more about the details of ewife and blueback herring. Aliki is our ecology coordinator here at CRC, and I'm just realizing we never introduced ourselves. My name's Kelsey. I'm the river steward for the state of Connecticut. I'm helping to manage the Connecticut portion of this work, along with Aliki, who also does work in Massachusetts.
Thanks, Kelsey. Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us again. So as a reminder to our previous volunteers and for our new volunteers, I'm just going to go over some basic information of the fish we've been talking about today. So as Kelsey mentioned, we've been saying river herring, but truthfully, there are two fish that we'll be working with throughout the season. It's ewife and blueback herring. And don't worry, we will not be asking you to identify two different species from the riverbank. These two fish are so similar in appearance in reality that the best way to tell them apart is to cut them open, which we don't want to do. So the key identifiers to river herring are their dark blue backs and their clear white bellies. So from the riverbank, you'll mostly be seeing their dark blue backs that might look a little bit more gray than dark blue. And the reason they have this coloration is it's sort of a camouflage to both predators from above and below. The clear belly sort of camouflages them with the sunlight above them, and then their gray, dark blue back camouflages them with the rocks below. Another key identifier is their V-shaped tail. It's a very defined V. And so when you look at the riverbank, the best thing you can do when you see fish is to look at their tail and see if you see that V. And another point is mostly for those of you who might be seeing dead fish on the riverbank, is they have a sawtooth belly, a very sharp belly. But most of you might not be needing this information since you probably won't find a lot of them dead on the riverbank. Great, thanks, Kelsey. So this is what a large school of river herring looks like from the bank. We probably won't be seeing schools this large. We saw this one close to where they were trapping the river herring. You will probably see fewer than these, but this is sort of to give you an idea of what you'd be looking at. Next slide. So here you have on the left side a dead river herring that was picked from the riverbank, and a few river herring swimming upstream next to it. And then another way to figure out if river herring were passing through a river or not is to be able to see evidence of their passage. And so that would be seeing if you can see any scales at the bottom of the river. Right here on the picture with the red circle, it's kind of hard to see, but you can sort of see sparkles at the edge under the branches, and so those would be the scales that they leave behind sometimes when they pass in large amounts in an area that has a lot of wood or rock debris. They will often knock themselves on things and they will leave their scales behind. And then of course you might see dead fish on the riverbank. I think if you were closer to southern Connecticut, close to the mouths of the tributaries, you might see more of that, where the predators in the early morning would be waiting for the river herring to pass by to catch them and leave them on the bank. So here's a quick little video so you can sort of see how they move in the water. All right, so let's see if you can catch that. You'll see a few of them go right under that log. They're kind of hard to spot, but you can see shadows. Do you see their grayish dark blue backs passing through? There was just one there a second ago. We will be sharing this these slides with you all, so you'll be able to review this video when you have more time. Great. Oh, there's another section. Yeah, so it's not very easy to see, and it's definitely not very easy to film when you see them. But if you keep a sharp eye on the water, might be able to see them here too. Can you go to the next slide, Kelsey? So places that we'll be asking you to check are below any dams or other barriers. They like to pull there. It's sort of when they get stuck, you'll see them there. And then if you are near a bridge, it's also good to see under bridges or other interesting locations along the river. And then we're not asking you to stay too long when you get to the river. It's sort of like a 10-15 minute affair maximum, where you kind of just go, you sit by the river, you enjoy the morning if you're a morning person, or the afternoon if you'd rather do it later, and just sort of look at the river and observe, see what you might find in the river. It's a great time to just spend outdoors as well. And we'd just be asking you to take some notes of what you're seeing. And even if you're not seeing any fish, which might be the case for a lot of you, this data is really important, as Kelsey and Kevin mentioned earlier. It's very important to us that we know what you're seeing, even if you're not seeing anything. So take notes of everything or anything that you might see or might not see, and we'll appreciate it. And then, of course, staying safe and practicing good river etiquette when you're out in the field. It's, our volunteer safety is, of course, our priority. So we want to make sure that if you feel like you're not in a good situation, or if you're trying to climb down a riverbank and it doesn't feel safe, or the water is moving too fast, of course, we've been saying the data is important, but we want to make sure you're safe and you're being responsible, especially if you're going out with little ones. We also want to make sure that you're aware of where you're serving. So you'll be working with me and Kelsey throughout the season in Connecticut and Massachusetts, respectively, to assess your sites, and we'll make sure that if you're in an area that is hard to access, we'll give you all the resources that you might need. And if we're talking about private property, We just ask that you be careful, and I don't think, Kelsey, we have a lot of sites on the private property anyways, but so that issue shouldn't come up anyways. As it was mentioned earlier, it's illegal to catch river herrings. So so if you see dead ones, you probably should leave them anyways. But you can pictures are always welcome, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. If you see dead river herring on the bank, we'd love to see pictures of your findings. And then you'll probably meet a lot of people in the morning. You'll probably see a lot of fishermen by the riverbank, so feel free to make friends. And what to bring. So polarized sunglasses are really helpful for these surveys. They allow you to look at the streams in the river without the sunlight glare. So we highly recommend you get yourself a cheap pair, or if you already have a pair, you use it ahead of the season. A flashlight if you visit a site at sundown or sunrise, though if you're alone, we do recommend that you try and avoid going late at night or when the sun isn't up yet, just as safety precautions. Definitely water resistant footwear. You never know what you're gonna step in. A camera is very helpful. We'd love to see pictures, even if you don't see any fish. We'd like to see what you see. Your data sheet, which actually will probably turn into a form, but for those of you who are not smartphone users and you're interested in having paper form, we can make that happen for you. And of course, a water bottle and a change of clothes in the car. You never know what might happen.
All right, and then just before we wrap up, I'll add one reason we have the sort of early in the morning, later in the evening on there is because that's when you're more likely to see some fish. So if you are able to go out closer towards the early part of the morning or later in the evening, and if you're able to do that safely, then there's a greater chance since the fish will be a little bit more active. And this, I think we just have one or two more slides, but this is our map of the Connecticut portion. As Kevin mentioned earlier, we're not really doing any of this particular river herring surveys north of Holyoke because they're just not getting up and over the dam in great quantities. So here is, and we'll send all this information out, but here's a list of where our priority spots. As you can see, it covers pretty much the entire Connecticut River in Connecticut. However, if there is a stream near you and it's not on here, that doesn't necessarily mean we don't want to see that data. We're always curious to learn more about other streams that you think should be on here, keeping in mind that if you are above a dam or an impediment to fish passage, we're probably not going to see herring there anyway, so it just may be eliminated for that reason. But wanted to go over that quickly. And there are a few sites, so if you're here from Massachusetts, don't despair. We do have those as well, and we had several volunteers from Southern Massachusetts help us out. All right, so how to actually do the job. As Aliki mentioned, we're asking people to go out to an area near them, and we're going to figure out, as I said, we have all these sites, so in the registration form we'll send out, you can kind of select which sites you'd prefer to go to, and then we ask that you go there about 2 to 3 times per week. We're planning to start the week of April 12th. And then we finished up sometime in June last year. So it is sort of a long season that we're asking you to monitor, which is why we want to make sure this is something you can do sustainably as a part of your schedule. It's okay to miss a couple times. We understand people go on vacation, you have other life obligations. If you do find that it's too much, please let us know. Sometimes we can reassign volunteers who want to take on a bit more. But yeah, we're looking for 2 to 3 times per week. You can switch it up if you want to go in the morning or the evening. It doesn't have to be those times, and report that data back to us. So I will show the data reporting form in just a minute, but we're asking that once you've gone through the week, you report all that data by Sunday evening at the latest so that we're staying current. We talked about Steve's fish report. We are going to try and share data with you. So if you can get that to us in a timely manner, that's really helpful. And ideally the day of, because I know for myself, when I don't do something immediately, I absolutely just forget what I saw and what I did. So best to do it as soon as possible. You can report data on your phone if you have internet and you're not afraid of dropping it in the water. But we'll also send you a sheet that you can print out, fill out in the field, and then input that in your phone or your computer later if you'd rather have that hard copy. If you need accommodations, especially if you have trouble with our online way of doing this, let us know. We want to make sure that this is accessible to everyone as possible. And this has been mentioned a couple times now, but it can't be mentioned too many times. Zeros are still really important data. So last year we had a couple volunteers who sadly never saw any river herring at all. That's not actually that infrequent. I just want to set your expectations now, but that's actually really helpful information for us. So if you don't see anything, please don't think, I don't need to report my data this week because there wasn't anything. Having zeros tells us that, okay, we don't have fish in this area. What are the projects and what are the policies we need to be promoting to restore fish populations to that area? And so I'm gonna try and stop sharing and then reshare this form. All right, so you should be seeing our river herring data collection form now. It's pretty straightforward. We want your name, and then you'll be able to select which water body you observed from this list. Again, we can update this if we end up adding more sites, or that can go into the town or crossroads will let us get a little bit more specific with that, especially if we have people who are going out, for example, to Keeney Cove. There are several places we look at Keeney Cove, so having this information is very helpful for keeping track of where you are, the date, and then quantity of herring observed. And this can be pretty approximate. So we're essentially looking for presence, absence data. Did you see herring, yes or no? And then if yes, to the best of your ability, guess how many you saw. And all in all, this whole process of observing and data recording can take 10 minutes or less, even 5. So usually if you've been there for 5 minutes and you don't see anything, in all likelihood, you're not going to. And if you see something, then that's great. Let us know about it. If you see predators hanging about or dead fish, scales, put that in the notes and observations here. Or if you just see something really cool you want to tell us about, or if you have a concern, let us know. You can also always email us photos and that sort of thing. We love to see what you're seeing out in the field. And with that, I think that's about all we had. I see there are some questions in the chat, but we're also happy to take your questions now.
Just should we just start with what's in the chat, Kelsey? I think the first one I'm most curious about is looker scope. I'm not sure what a looker scope is. Do you know what that is?
I don't know what that is, but is it sort of like a magnifying lens, or
maybe like sort of what do you call them?
Binoculars. Yeah. Oh, it should be, as long as you have polarized glasses, that could be helpful. If you are up, there are some sites up on bridges where you're kind of looking down. If you have something that can help you see that, I'd say it doesn't hurt. I see. Is there a threshold for time after sunrise, before sunset that's optimal with 1 or 2 hours? Yeah, I'd say within 1 or 2 hours. So sort of if you're familiar with golden hour, that kind of beautiful time of day where it's not quite sunset, but it's dusky, dawn. That's a great time to go out. They'll be a little bit more active. Or even if you are awake early, it's okay to go kind of right after sunrise. Again, as long as you feel safe.
There was a question about Keeney Cove in Glastonbury, Kelsey, if CTD could clear the area near the mouth of of the river.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I'll talk to Kevin about that and see. I actually haven't been out there in quite some time now, so I'm not familiar with it myself, but if that is an impediment, we would definitely want to clear that out and look into it. So thank you. I'll write that down.
I see there's some questions about Massachusetts sites. So we just started doing Massachusetts sites in 2020, and we have not gone above the Holyoke Dam. As Kevin had mentioned, very few fish across the Holyoke Dam, and even though the data can always be very helpful, our resources will be more helpful below, south of the Holyoke Dam. So the rivers we're looking at this year include the Chicopee River, the Westfield River, and I think it's the 3 Mile Brook that is behind the Six Flag amusement park. If there are folks who are interested in surveying a stream or river near their house that they know could bring good data to the table, we're welcome to work with you. Just know that in general, very few river herring unfortunately pass the Holyoke Dam. So the chances of you seeing river herring above the dam are pretty slim.
Okay, I see a comment from Halst. Yeah, please do send us that information. That sounds great. Oh, so maintain a frequency at the same location for observation. Yes, that's a good question. Kind of goes along with Danelle's question. We are gonna, after this call, we're gonna send out a registration for anyone who wants to commit to doing the volunteering. You'll be able to select which site or sites, if you want to do multiple, that you're interested in looking at. And then we'll ask that, we'll coordinate with you to kind of give you the details on where specifically to go, since of course, you know, if I say Scantic River, that's a lot of river to cover, and we're not asking you to do the whole thing. Just, we do have some specific areas, and we'll send those details to you. And we probably likely will have multiple volunteers monitoring one site. And that's because in all likelihood, those volunteers aren't going to always be going out at the same time of day or the same days of the week. So it gives us an even more complete data set. And we're happy to connect those volunteers. If they want to coordinate who's going on which days, we can do that. Or you're welcome to just go when's convenient for you. But yes, frequency at the same location over time. Are there any other fish species besides the herring that you would be likely to see in these areas? Yeah, there's a huge variety of fish in the Connecticut River, so it's definitely likely that you'll see them. Of course, now I'm kind of blanking. You'll see shad, which are also a kind of herring. But yes, and I actually, if you have a smartphone, there is an app called iNaturalist. And you can take photos of whatever you're seeing. It does a really good job of identifying those species. I see a question from Grace. I live in Fairfield's non-CT river streams and rivers. So we are focused just on the Connecticut River watershed, so all the tributaries within that. If you're not too far from one of those tributaries, we'd love to have you. But there are other programs who run almost kind of an identical program to us, and the state, as you heard, uses this information across the entire state. So our focus is just Connecticut River watershed, but if you're visiting this call from elsewhere, email us and we can probably connect you with some of those groups who are doing this work outside of the watershed. Yes. Eliki, do you mind putting our contact info in the chat?
Yeah, I can
Cool.
do that.
And you can also find it on our website, ctriver.org. Oh, good question. Okay, is it more difficult to see and count the herring on days when it's raining due to drops on the surface? Yeah, disturbance on the surface may make it a little difficult to distinguish what you're seeing under the water, but I'd say actually in a lot of ways it could be easier because what makes it difficult to see herring and anything under the water really is the glare from the sun. So yeah, it'll be a little bit easier maybe. If it's really truly terrible weather, you don't have to go out though. I think it's fine to go out in the rain. What is the average size in inches of herring? Yuliki, do you know? I want to say, I mean, go ahead.
I don't know in inches, but it's about, forearm. Well, actually, smaller than a forearm. But no, I don't know the numbers.
And again, that's a good question. We're happy to add that to our follow-up email. All right. We have a couple minutes left and we're happy. Deep Sight says 10 inches. Thank you, Deb.
Can I just ask a question? Is there a difference? The herring and the ewife, how do you say that?
Alewife?
Ewife, they're one and the same? Because you haven't shown, I'm not that, I don't know that much about it. So alewife is the same thing as a herring?
So yeah, it's a good question. And definitely no need for prior knowledge. They are both, it's confusing. They're both river herring, but they are different types of river herring. So they are not exactly the same, but for the purposes of this program, we're counting them all as the same because for us, for most of us, it would be very difficult to distinguish them when you're looking into the river. And in fact, oftentimes you need to take them out of the river and do harm to them to basically tell. So we're definitely not doing that. If you see an alewife, a blueback herring, doesn't really matter. They're all within the river herring family.
Okay, thank you. That's all. I thought there were two different things at all, but they're just a different species. So they're going to look like a fish.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And we'll send out pictures and hopefully some scale so you can see kind of size-wise and shape-wise what to look for.
Now, what's also in the Farmington River, they have suckers and they climb. What are they called?
The sea lamprey.
The sea lamprey. Yeah. So are you interested in those also, or that?
Definitely, yes.
Oh, so
We run sea lamprey surveys in June and July. If you're interested in those, you can also email us. Those are led pretty much all over the watershed. Sea lampreys go further up than the river herring do. So we do need help in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. Again, I'd say, Kelsey, mid-June to beginning of July. And they're nest surveys. So we wade through rivers that are about knee-high maximum probably, and we essentially look for the nests that they build up at the bottom of the river.
Thank you. And I'm living in Windsor Loch, so I'm more interested in the Farmington River and the dam on the Farmington River in Windsor. Has the fish ladders been repaired? Are they going to be changed? How are they doing going up into the reservoir?
I'll check on that for you. I'll ask Kevin what the status of those fish ladders are. I will say for our sea lamprey surveys, we actually don't survey the Farmington just because this type of survey is in the water, walking up river, which as you can imagine in the Farmington is much more difficult than it would be in a small brook or stream. But I'll ask about the status of the fishway.
Thank you both for everything that you are doing. I appreciate you so much.
Thanks for being here. We're very glad to see you. I see a question, would river herring be found in the Essex coves near the surface? So we do expect that there could be river herring in Essex, particularly looking at the Falls River. As Aliki mentioned earlier, good places to look tend to be below an impediment, so below a dam, in smaller streams. You might be able to see them in those coves, but I think it would just be a little bit more challenging than looking in a stream or a river, a smaller stream or river.
Regarding the shad versus herring question above the Holyoke Dam. So the shad are a lot more common in the Connecticut River than the herring are. And as Kevin mentioned, not seeing herring above the Holyoke Dam is not necessarily due to the Holyoke Dam. Obviously, it is a barrier, so it is part of the problem. But another issue is the population of the river herring that has significantly been reduced. And so they tend to not go as far up, essentially. They tend to just spread further down the river, contrary to shad. And then if river herring can be found in a swift river, so right, again, so rivers above the Holyoke Dam will have probably river herring, but we're talking about, Kelsey, I don't know if we still have that chart up. I don't remember how many river herring passed the Holyoke Dam last year, but I think it was a couple thousand, which is really nothing compared to what it's been in the past. And so the likeliness of us being able to see said couple thousand, further up, it's quite unlikely. So that's why we're not, we're not spending a lot of efforts looking for them further up. We're more focused on getting a sense of their population in general and helping organizations like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and CT Deep restore their habitat.
How about the shad counts?
Those exist too. We don't do any at CRC, but I know that you can find data from the hydropower companies that have counters. And I'm sure, Kelsey, there are programs that I know U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a program.
Yeah, and I think at the Holyoke Dam, at least, they have someone counting.
Yes,
they
record and they count, right?
Yeah.
Are the river shad running now? Are the shad running at the same time? And if they are, how do you tell the difference between the shad and the alewife and blueback herring?
Good question. So shad are not running just yet. A good way to remember it is if you're familiar with the plant shad bush, it's sort of a white, smelly tree that blooms April to May. That actually coincides with the shad run. So they're a little bit later than the river herring, and well, they're also a type of river herring, but a good way to tell them apart is actually just the size. They're much bigger.
Thank you.
Good question. All right, I see we're right at 6:30. I don't want to cut off any questions, but certainly feel free to email us if something came up that you're curious about. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining. We're going to send out a follow-up email with registration info. We'll be starting around the week of April 12th in Connecticut, a little bit later if you're in Massachusetts, and we'll get that info out to you ASAP. Thanks for joining, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.